Welcome to the afternoon event. I see everybody's mood is elevated. Maybe that's because of the change in laws here. Not to say that the mood is high, but people seem to be doing well and happy. So you come here normally to see cool things, cool new results, new techniques, maybe meet new people, definitely hear new gossip. I know that's why you're here. But what we don't do so often is examine what we actually do, is examine the foundations of cognitive neuroscience. And so we thought we'd do that a little bit today. So I assume that you're here at the CNS meeting because you're actually interested in the relationship between cognition or psychology and neuroscience. If you're not, then I don't know why you're here. You should probably leave now. But you could go to the Cognitive Science Society or APS or Psychonomics. You could go to the Society for Neuroscience or COSIGN or something like that. And there's pretty unlikely that there's going to be a session that asks, what's the relationship between neuroscience and neuroscience? It's just not going to be that way. But in cognitive neuroscience, we have to face the music. We can't pretend there are not serious issues, epistemic cuts or difficulties in solving the problems we're interested in. Now, the conceptual foundations of our field are, I assume, more than just having correlations, right? We're not just interested in having a concept from the cognitive sciences or psychology and then relate it in some way to some neural measurement we make. Now, that's what we do, and there's nothing wrong with correlation. Correlation is a beautiful thing. But I assume that our yearning is higher, our aims are more ambitious, and although correlation is great and, let's say, regression, which is like the most flavor of the day in data analysis, is a wonderful thing, it can't be that that's all we want. We must want more. So there's a few issues that can bug us, and we're gonna unpack them this afternoon. So you see, the title is the relation between psychology and neuroscience. And let's just briefly review why there's a problem. So I'm going to try this now. Yeah, this is this clicker, which looks like it was made with glue stick. And you did say press it firmly, so I pressed it firmly. Okay. So here's, very briefly, trust me, I won't hog the stage for too long, but here's a quote that I rather like from a book about philosophy, which I actually can't read from this angle. I'm going to make these guys here read it out loud. Okay, Evan, you read it out loud.
Cognitive neuroscience operates...
Okay, let me try. Cognitive neuroscience operates across the boundary between two fields, neurophysiology and psychology, the respective concepts of which are categorially dissimilar. And I think that's where the underline should be. The things that we talk about are categorially dissimilar. The logical or conceptual relations between the physiological and the psychological are problematic. The relations between the mind and brain are bewildering. And if you don't think that's true, then you also are in the wrong room. If you think that the things we are working on are easy and straightforward, you're just mistaken. So, just to briefly illustrate the nature of the problem, I just clicked very lightly. So here's just a list of a few. This is like the steak at lunch. Here's a list of I'll go for this side. Of a few kind of foundational concepts that you're familiar with from neuroscience that are completely not bewildering, because this is the kind of the stuff we study. Stuff like a channel or a dendrite or an ensemble of neurons or a process like LTP or LTD or oscillation. And there's you can maybe debate about the minutiae of this, but you're not going to have fundamental disagreements about their relevance. Now, here, possibly, yes, is a similar list for some list of psychological concepts that we may use to talk about cognition, behavior, psychology, things like attention or affect, volition, memory, language, concepts, or processes like prediction, association, discrimination, generalization, and so on. Now, again, that's what you learn in psychology, and you're not going to put up a big fight that those aren't relevant concepts. But the problem is that we haven't even the vaguest idea about how to relate those. And if you think otherwise, let me know, because then I can be rich and famous. But the fact of the matter is we really don't, beyond correlative information between these domains. Likewise, we can say, well, look, we all read, or we were supposed to read for class, this book by Marr, which distinguishes a computational, an algorithmic, and an implementational level. Again, extremely useful way to partition complicated things. But to formally find relationships between these is actually quite an astonishingly difficult thing. And here, for instance, tomorrow we have a symposium on mesoscale versus macroscale and microscopic clicking behavior. Forceful. I'll step on it. So again, I mean, are you doing work at the microscopic level, which is, feels real because we're kind of dualists, right? You measure stuff and you can touch it, so it must be real. At the mesoscale, which are sort of mystical things that we think probably matter for neural coding, or the macroscopic scale, which is the stuff we measure and then correlate with everything. So no matter how you carve the problem up, and no matter what aspect of psychology or the cognitive sciences you study, the problem is really quite more difficult when you start to look into where the cuts lie between the stuff that we are made of and the stuff of thought. This is a difficult problem. Now, we have 4 people who are solving it for us today, which is great. You should take excellent notes. So Leila Davachi is at the far end, who's a professor at Columbia University. Well, you all know this already, and whose expertise. So I picked, for under each very brief description of what each person works on, one of my favorite papers from each person, so you know what, run and go read it. So, and Leila is, of course, very famous for her work on memory, on episodic memory, on event structure, on medial temporal lobe systems, and so on. Next to Leila is Jennifer Groh. Jenny is an expert in eye movement control and coordinate transformations in neural coding, so works much more at the systems neuroscience and computational neuroscience level. Kate Hartley is next to Jenny, is a professor of psychology and works on decision-making, on motivation, and on development. And Sharon Thompson-Schill is a psychology professor who works on concepts, on language, on semantics. Those are all papers that I particularly like, but there's much more stuff of them that you ought to read. And we're going to forcefully get through the section. Since this is the last time I'll have the stage, I wanted to quickly get off of my chest what I wanted to recommend you read. If you're a graduate student or a postdoc or just a human being, and you can read, you should read these things. This is good stuff. Read Konrad Lorenz, The Foundations of Ethology. Or read Nicholas Tinbergen, The Study of Instinct. Read David Marr's book Vision. Read the essays of Howard Patty. Read Bennett and Hacker's book on the philosophy of neuroscience. These are all cool things, and you should take your time, study it, and enjoy it, and then go out and enjoy the new laws. So now each participant will spend a few minutes outlining sort of what they think are the big issues, and then we'll have a discussion together for a little while, and then open it up to questions as soon as we feel it's the right moment, which could be very soon or very late in the game. Depends on how this discussion goes. So Leila is the first person to come, and hopefully the clicker, forceful clicking.
Thank you. Hi there. So I'll just start by saying, a couple of minutes, and I'm not going to tell you anything that's surprising. I have no answers. But I really was thankful to David and to the conversations I had with everyone sitting up here to just get a chance to sit with the questions about how do we think these two fields are interacting? What's the value of the work that we do? It's so easy to get bogged down in the experiments and the data. We love the data. That's why we're here, right? But it's also, I think, important to stop and think. And until David had asked me to serve on this panel, I realized it had been a long, long time since I had sat down and started to, give myself a chance to think about these ideas. So I apologize if what I'm going to share with you seems rather simplistic. That's where my thinking is, and we can continue the conversation. But I thought it might be useful to just first the answer depends on what your goals are, right? What is the goal of what we're all doing? And there are several goals we have as psychologists and cognitive neuroscientists, and one is to describe behavior. And one way to think about that is what happens, when it happens, how can you measure it? At another level is to predict behavior. I can't even read that. What varies with what? So what you can move around one factor and show that behavior is moving around in another way, right? Describing behavior. But ultimately, we want to explain behavior, right? So the idea here is you can understand more causally what kinds of manipulations lead to different kinds of effects. And ideally, you maybe want an explanatory you want an explanation for behavior so that you can change behavior, right? You can modify it in some way, and a lot of people care about changing behavior. But then it dawned on me that one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what is the nature of an explanation? What is an explanation? And it's not a question to take for granted. But there are many questions that people ask. These are the kinds of questions that my children have asked me, and maybe you've been asked. So what's an explanation for how a bird flies? What's an explanation for how an engine works? Why are peas green? Or maybe, why do you not like Mondays, Mommy? That's one that I get. What do these questions all have in common? What they have in common is that they describe causal relationships. The answer would describe relationships between phenomena at different levels. And the important thing about that is the levels of analysis. So to understand any of these sort of simple questions, you have to give an answer that describes the relationship between elements, constituent elements at one level, to understand the emergent properties that are there at another level. So what we're doing here are two levels: imagine cognition or thinking and information processing and neuroscience. And there's a lot of work you can do at each individual level to understand the elements. What are the elements of cognition? How do they work? What are the elements of neuroscience? But what we're doing here is trying to build rules or understand the computations that bridge across the two levels. And I think Elizabeth started the session this evening by talking about bridges in San Francisco, and that's really why what we're doing is so complicated. Because unpacking the bridging laws is above and beyond understanding the constituent elements. So an explanation is not good enough to define the sort of elements that are there in the brain, the neurons, for example, even the networks or the firing. It's not enough to describe the elements. You have to understand how they interact and give rise to the emergent properties of memory and attention and decision making. And so it's extremely complicated. But there is hope, because there are emergent properties all over the place. And so here are a couple of my favorite examples: a flock of birds. And when you watch hundreds of birds fly together, you can't explain the behavior of the flock by anything that's in an individual bird. It turns out, though, that there are computations in an individual bird, like the distance you maintain from fellow birds and not to run into them and to follow them in some way, and also to avoid predators, that when put together can explain the emergent behavior of the flock. But it's not enough to know what a single bird is doing. The same thing with water. Water, there's nothing more simple than three molecules, H2O. But understanding, if you put, let's say, a jillion molecules together, you get water. And water has emergent properties that are not there in the molecules that make up water. One, for example, is liquidity, like what you see on the screen. That does not occur in the molecules. When you freeze it, it turns to ice. So there are these are emergent properties. And I think that cognition, consciousness, attention, and memory, those are emergent properties that come from the interactions, the complicated interactions of the constituent elements of the brain. So I should have done more clicking. Here we go. So entirely new properties emerge that are not explainable by the constituent parts. And just to sort of break it down, so you might have behavior and brain. And one of the things we might be asking ourselves in our own work is, well, what is the right level? And an important point that I want to make today is that I feel, as a scientist that's been around for a long time, and I've studied systems neuroscience, and now I'm studying what I'm studying, and I feel like there are these paradigms of science where there seems to be this chauvinism about what the right level of analysis is, and that's all wrong. Every level is equally likely to contribute to the answer, but you have to pick the right level based on your question. So if you just break down behavior, there is the individual, which is what we all work on. We study cognition. We want to understand how the mind works. So typically you're working with one person, but then there are dyads. What happens to cognition when you're talking to someone? What about group behavior? Group behavior is another emergent property that comes out of our own cognitive systems. And then there are micro scales of behavior, like micro behaviors, micro sort of mini eye movements. There are things you can measure. Implicit memory, for example, that could be a kind of micro behavior. And then in the brain, of course, we have areas that we measure typically with BOLD. There are neurons. There are networks, and then there are oscillations, and all of these are other levels of analysis. And again, I just want to reiterate that there is, I don't think, any right level. And what's really important is to think about what your questions are. And one of the things I'd like to tell my students, and I like to tell myself often, is if I get stuck thinking about data or a question, I need to take a walk and really think more clearly about what am I trying to ask here? What is my question? And that should help you to identify what the right level for your analysis is, and then what kind of bridging laws you want to attempt to come up with to kind of bridge across those levels. And this is just another example of the bridging law. So you have sort of abilities and cognition, computation, and neuroscience. And what we do is happening in the middle, the edges between these areas. There's a lot to do at any one of these levels, but all of the hard work that we're engaging in, I think, is happening in the vertices, on these edges here, and these little lines that you might overlook that just connect the triangle. That's where all of the hard work is that we're doing. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to try pressing this firmly. I understand that's the way to make it work.
Yes.
Okay. When David emailed me and asked me to be part of this panel, I wrote back right away. And if you've ever emailed me before, you know that's not typical behavior. And the reason is because I've been thinking a lot at sort of a meta level about, what are we trying to do and are we on the right track? In part because of my day job affiliations, I'm sort of never quite clear where the boundaries between different disciplines are. I have appointments in a neurobiology department as well as a department that is called both psychology and neuroscience. So, figuring out where the what is neuroscience, what is psychology is sometimes not clear to me. So the way I conceive of the questions, though, are sort of, are you working more at the electrode level or more at the scanner level? So I think the a thing that emerges based on these two different kind of levels of inquiry is that we're making different assumptions about what is functionally significant, and so if you can see, I can't see this picture, but from what I can remember, I put up here, there's a person sort of facing forward that I think of as sort of cognitive neuroscience or scanner approaches. And then there's a person walking away. And to me, that feels a little like what has been happening over the last 10 years at the more neurobiological approaches. Because what I think has been happening in neurobiology has been a focus at ever more granular levels of detail, where it is to me not completely clear that we knew what to do with the level of granular detail we had. So it's been very hard, I think, to connect that with what's been happening in more of the scanner-level cognitive neuroscience, which has been emphasizing, and I think rightly so, that the brain is operating as a series of interconnected nodes, that the network level of analysis is incredibly important. Okay. Sorry. So another thing that has been on my mind has been the differences among these different techniques in the opportunities to make discoveries of things you were not looking for. So I think, so this is a cartoon from the old comic strip Mutt and Jeff, and it starts off with a guy is looking for something, and the policeman, for whatever reason, asks him, you know, why are you looking here? And he says, because the light is better here. And so I think, you know, if the field is being too driven by techniques, you're at risk of doing experiments because you can and not because you necessarily have a profoundly important underlying question that needs to be addressed that way. So that's something that I've been watching happen from time to time. In particular, I think the optogenetic approaches, as an example, the way, for those of you who are less familiar with it, one way this technique is used is that you get a virus expression of rhodopsin, channel rhodopsin in one part of the brain, and you shine light in another part of the brain so that you can probe a particular connection in a particular behavioral context. So I think if you do an experiment like that, you can only discover something about that particular connection in that behavioral context, which is, of course, what you know, the experiment is designed to do. But one of the things that I have really valued, not as someone who uses fMRI, but as someone who sort of observes the discoveries unfolding in the field, is that you all who use this technique can discover things you were not looking for. And I think those kinds of discoveries have really moved the field forward in ways that perhaps no one could have anticipated. Let's see. Okay, psychology. One of the things that comes up in the context of psychology is to think about replication. Well, I sort of have some envy about replication issues in psychology. I can't remember what my bullet points are, and I can't read them, so I'll just go with what I can remember about them. So we have a couple of different problems. One is that we can't necessarily tell when we're replicating in neuroscience because, in particular, the older literature is insufficiently quantitative for us to be able to even ascertain, did we get the same result as someone who did an experiment, a similar experiment before? A second issue is that what? Oh, yeah, excellent, thank you. Okay. Excellent, so point number two. Sometimes we're doing too much replication. In particular, when a new technique is being developed, it's often tested on things that we already know the answer to. That is certainly a valuable way to test the technique. However, it isn't necessarily something I want to be reading if I'm not interested in using that technique. But then I think probably the most important point to make is that when we do fail to replicate, when, you know, maybe that might be too strong of a way to say it, but when there's some reason to doubt an established finding, we are not doing the extra work that is needed to make sure that we sort of move those findings off of the sort of primary list, the canon of things that get taught to new students entering the field. And so the fact that we have checked something, tested to see whether or not it replicates, is kind of lost because people just keep believing the old stuff. Oh, I have to move this to make it. Okay. Okay, I think maybe a final point is we cannot test everything. We need a plan. It is not going to be, you know, understanding of how the brain works, how it leads to behavior is probably not going to come from testing every single condition that you can imagine testing. So I don't really have an answer to that. I think that we want to start thinking about how we can focus on general principles. People can think about how exactly we can generalize from the experiments that we do. And there are other disciplines that have thought about this a little bit. For example, in statistics, there's a concept of you're going to sample some of the population. You're not going to ask you're not going to query every single member of a population. Computer science brings us a number of concepts that I think are useful, such as concepts of efficient search. If you know something is happening somewhere between here and here, a good way to look for where it is happening is to keep splitting the distance in half. Computer science also brings us other concepts of sort of how do we abstract to general principles. We don't think of computing as being based on getting your transistors from a particular manufacturer. There's a concept of software and algorithm that is at play. Let's see what else I've got. Okay, so some advice for young neuroscientists. Yeah, I know, but it didn't go. Okay. So I guess I would say try to focus on issues of functional and computational significance and have some kind of a plan for generalizing. And seek ways to be lucky. Seek ways to put yourself in a position where you can discover something you weren't necessarily looking for. And I think that comes from sort of just paying really close attention and looking carefully at your data, looking at it in ways you didn't plan to necessarily. Okay, I'll stop. Thank you.
Hi. So like both Leila and Jenny, when I was asked by David to do this, I really had to give a great deal of thought to the question. We're all really in the business of studying the intersection between cognitive processes, behavior, and the underlying neural implementation of these constructs. And one of the kind of central questions is, what are the right kind of linking hypotheses that we should be forming that really tie these different constructs together? And I think Leila made an important point that the right kind of linking hypotheses really depends on what your goal is. I think many of us have a goal of understanding how cognitive processes are giving rise to behavior. And I'll give you sort of what I think of as a thought experiment, like what is the right way in which we can achieve this goal. So increasingly, we have large amounts of neural data. There are technological innovations that give us the ability to record from many, many neurons at once. This is really an enterprise that has been sweeping through neuroscience. As well, in the scanner world, we obtain lots of data from the whole brain. And I think increasingly, with the widespread adoption of machine learning techniques, there's been a focus on using these massive amounts of data that we have to try and predict behavior. And of course, this is a really important enterprise. If we understand something, then surely we should be able to predict how neural computations are giving rise to behavior. But would this be sufficient if we had a sort of black box, a predictive system? And here I don't mean the cognitive process of prediction, but any kind of mapping between these neural measurements and the behavioral output. If we're able to predict that, is that sufficient? Does that achieve the goal of understanding behavior? And I think from a psychological perspective, the answer is clearly no. And I think Leila made this point as well, that our goal is not simply, so if we are able to predict behavior, but we have no idea how that black box is functioning, then I don't think we've accomplished our goal of understanding. So understanding, I think, requires a level of explanation. And I think we're all in the enterprise of either, we believe that, that although we are undertaking a really complex effort to identify some mapping between brain and behavior, that if we are cognitive neuroscientists, we believe that, that it's not a futile enterprise to try and derive an understanding, an explanation of what that transformation function is. So what would constitute an explanation? So we are tasked with specifying what are the latent processes that go in this black box. The nature of these processes, of course, are the representations that are important for generating our behavior and the computations that are being performed on those representations of our world. So are there successful examples of psychological sort of theories of formulating, specifying the nature of the representations and computations that are being performed that give us insight into the neural implementation? So I had to think about sort of success stories of good linking hypotheses that have given us insights into underlying neural implementation. And one is trichromatic theory. So in really beautiful work in the early 19th century, Young and Helmholtz did a series of psychophysics experiments, really having individuals match the perceived color of a single wavelength of light with 1 or 2 or 3 knobs that they could turn to sort of calibrate the wavelengths that they felt generated a perceived color that matched. And they inferred from the behavioral data, from this psychological experimentation, that 3 knobs that emitted light at short, medium, and long wavelengths appeared to be sufficient to produce the perceived colors. And this, of course, predated by 150 years, I believe, the discovery of 3 types of photoreceptor cells that are sensitive to short, long, and medium and long wavelengths. So again, an inference about the way the computations the brain here, the eye, needs to carry out in order to approximate the behavior that's being observed. Okay, so another one. And this is very much a different kind of theory. So cognitive maps, so the work of Tolman in the mid-20th century, he was really challenging a pervasive view in animal learning that behavior could be understood through sort of the formation of stimulus-response associations, and showed through behavioral experimentation that that current theories could not account for the types of representations that animals were displaying they had, that the theory was wrong, and that one needed a theory that encompassed representations of space and place and paths, and indeed, in subsequent work by O'Keefe and Nadel and by the Mosers, it was revealed that in the brain there are representations that enable us to carry out these kinds of computations. So again, an inference that could be drawn from behavior that was able to inform the search for what kinds of representations need to exist in the brain. Okay, and a third one. This doesn't really reflect a theory that came solely from the domain of psychology. I think there were many fields, including different fields of computer science and engineering, that were looking at similar types of processes. But the work of Verskorla and Wagner, in which observing animal behavior and trying to formulate what are the types of computations that can give rise to the dynamics of behavior that are observed in these sort of simple reinforcement learning experiments. And they proposed that what appears to be going on is something like an error-driven learning process, where the animal is sort of doing sequential updating between updating expectations and using experienced outcomes to drive this process. And then many years later, or in this case, not so many years later, it was discovered that the functioning of dopaminergic neurons appear to be carrying out a computation that is reasonably well approximated. Of course, we now know that there's much more complexity to the computations they're carrying out. But again, sort of specifying what a potential computation that could drive this sort of learning might look like, and indeed finding that sort of computation is carried out in the brain. So how do we go about if the enterprise that we're tasked with is generating good linking hypotheses, how do we go about doing this? These are maybe examples of places where we've succeeded, but what do we do as a field? And these are, again, these are things that, these are not novel ideas. These are things that we know. Theory building. So we all do experiments in our labs. We generate data, we test hypotheses, and we produce sort of, what I am calling here atomic data points, sort of single studies about how some manipulation pushes around behavior in a way. And I think, the really challenging thing is to draw kind of larger inferences from these atomic data points, to gather together the observations that you've made with the other observations that are present in the field and really make inferences from these data that allow you to account for a sort of broader set of phenomena, and ideally to take what seem to be sort of diverse or disparate phenomena and account for them with one sort of unifying theory. And this may be sort of, I think one way in which we can attempt to do this is to try, or one useful way of going about this enterprise is to try and construct generative models, to construct models that specify a process for producing a behavior or a neural measurement. When we understand a phenomenon well enough, then hopefully we can specify this as a formal model. And I think this is a somewhat controversial perspective, but by that I mean a sort of mathematical specification that makes quantifiable predictions. And that is not because these formulas are the way the system works. Sorry, I'm forgetting to keep you in line. Here you go. So the quote at the bottom is one I'm fond of. All models are wrong, but some models are useful. So I think these kinds of formal models that we have in our field are wrong, but they can be useful in that they make quantitative predictions. We can measure how far off they are. We can compare one model with another to see whether the introduction of some simulation of a cognitive process improves our predictive ability or impairs it? Does it seem to capture the data in a quantitative way? So these features of generative models are useful. And this last point sort of pertains to what is the right, what is really so revisiting prediction, which in the beginning I sort of said it can't be all that we're trying to do, but it's a really important part of understanding. So when you really understand the way a system works, you should be able to make predictions about how a measurement or a manipulation will influence behavior. And I think as a field, this really relates to the point about replicability that was raised earlier. As a field, we've observed that many findings that have been demonstrated in one laboratory may not be replicated in another. I think, questions of scientific integrity aside, one thing that we have to think about is when we fit models to data, there's always, and this applies to any sort of model, a regression model, there's always the potential that we've overfit the model, that we've introduced too many predictors, and that now we have a model that describes very well the data that we have in hand, but may not generalize to behavior that has not been seen by that specific model yet. And so I think as a field, we need to adopt practices like, and this doesn't mean do your experiment twice every time. This can mean something as simple as using cross-validation techniques and collecting a slightly larger sample and keeping some held-out data. This is the first step, I think, to creating models that will be able to explain behavior in subsequent observations. And I think this is one step towards the prediction component of the goal. Okay, thank you. Get off that slide, yeah.
Given the issues with the clicker and not being able to see the screen, I'm really glad that I made the decision not to bring slides. I'll just give you this. Really, has anyone ever seen something that looks like this before this century? So unlike my esteemed panelists, when David asked me to be on this panel to discuss this topic, I said no, because I had to be in New Jersey today. But I made it here 2 hours ago. I just got off an airplane. How many of you flew in here from somewhere? Show of hands. All right. And on your flight, if someone asks you what you were doing going to San Francisco, and you said you were a scientist, how many of you said you were a neuroscientist? Show of hands. Okay. And how many of you said you were a psychologist? Okay. And how many of you never took your headphones off so you wouldn't have to have a conversation like this? Okay. Smart. So I always answer the question neuroscientist because that stops the conversation. Because people, I think the assumption is, wow, that's really hard, and I can't talk to that person, and I'm just going to go back to watching A Star Is Born, which actually is what I was doing on the plane. But and when you say psychologist, like, oh, I now can talk to this person because they do something I can relate to, and it's easy. And I think the fact that I make that distinction in my mind, that there's not a transparency between the two of those, that there's something different. In this case, I'm saying one is hard and one is easy, is why this question is so important, right? It's not transparent what the relationship is, but it can't be simple, otherwise I wouldn't have to think how to answer that question because the answer wouldn't matter. So I say neuroscientist because it's hard, but when I was thinking about the relation between these, it's really the opposite, right? It's much easier to measure something physical than to measure something mental. And when I think about the relationship between neuroscience and psychology, I think that neuroscience is giving us an easier way to do something really hard. And again, that's not to say neuroscience is easy, but I think it's easier. And so when I struggle with what I'm doing and what I'm trying to understand, it's always the psychological questions that are hanging me up. And when I get a grasp on that, then the neuroscience piece seems like it's going to help out, like it's going to be a little easier. So the next time someone asks you what you're doing on a plane, just leave your headphones on. But if I hadn't started talking to this person, I actually probably would have made some slides, and then right now I'd be sitting here going like this and trying to see them. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
To a different clicker. Click me on. Yes? Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
So, other than these pithy, funny, engaging thoughts, there were a lot of isms. And I thought, and the isms that stuck out for me, that maybe we can draw out some more about the specific question about the relationship between psychology are, so Leila talked about level chauvinism, which is a kind of what we all do, namely if you work on V1, that you think that the neurons of V1 explain everything in perception. Jenny talked about a kind of methodological imperialism, as if you're a single unit person or an fMRI person, you see all problems through the lens of the data that you have access to, and maybe that ends up canalizing us into a certain way of asking questions that is, artificially restricted. Both Leila and Kate talked about a lot of, the idea of bridging laws and linking hypotheses. There was a lot of linking and bridgeism. And I think that's actually the one where we want to go, because that's the actually hard part. And then, of course, there's the, in the background, the thing that bothers me the most, and I already told Kate this at lunch, predictivism. It's not all about prediction, damn it. I know you want to predict everything in your mind, if we're to have successful bridging laws and linking hypotheses, where do we start? I mean, do we start by throwing out our narrow focus on the methods we're used to, or on the level of abstraction that we're used to? I mean, how do we go about what you want, which is an explanatory model that's beyond just prediction, as you pointed out?
Is this on? I don't have a full answer to your question. I'm not sure anybody does, but one thing that one clue that I feel means you're on the right track to something productive happening is if you have more than one hypothesis that you're testing, so that you can frame your question as, is it more like this or more like that? And this and that don't necessarily have to, at the end of the day, turn out to be the right thing, but that comparison is more fruitful than saying, is it this?
But do you think that students who are learning neuroscience now or psychology actually are familiar with the concept hypothesis? I mean, that's so quaint. I mean, is that actually a thing?
I recognize that you're asking a tongue-in-cheek question, but I think it's actually an important one, because I think there are people you could have asked to be on the stage today who would say that it's perfectly reasonable to do science without a hypothesis, that you can take data and discover sort of reliable relationships between data and behavior. This is your predictivism, right? You can discover reliable, replicable relationships between neural measurements and behavior and have no hypothesis or no explanation about what underlies the mapping. And I think this is increasingly common as we have very high-dimensional data sets. And where does that belong in your kind of scientific taxonomy? Is that informing? I mean, this is a question for everyone. Is that informing our understanding of behavior? I think is a really important question. Must all science be hypothesis-driven? I think hypotheses are really important for pinning down explanation, but I think there is a perspective that there can be discovery without explanation.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I wasn't going to respond to that, but I think that's a great. We all want discovery by accident, and we all have hypotheses. And I actually believe that we have hypotheses more than we let on from reading papers. And part of what's gone wrong with the system, and I'm feeling very rogue and rebellious about, I'm getting to an age where you can reflect back and get angry about things. But what's being rewarded in reading paper, getting a paper published and getting it out there and convincing people is a story. And a story is very important because you have to know how to place the data that's in the paper into a narrative. But the narrative always fits the data. And hypotheses are meant to be broken, or meant to not be met. And that's okay too, and that's really something that we can benefit from. And I just don't mean null results. I mean that often we have hypotheses about how behavior should move or how it should be related to representations in the brain, and we get something that's a little bit different, and then we're stuck with a dilemma about how do you write the paper. Do you write the paper so that it feels like the data fit in with your hypotheses or some hypothesis somewhere, or do you write the paper true to your process and the history of what you thought? And I always find it more compelling to think about why we didn't get, that's the discovery maybe, why you didn't get what you thought you might get. But there is a little bit of nugget of the world that we're in. We're all in a world and we buy into the things we need to do. And it's important to talk about where we think we are being best served as scientists, and where we think our papers and our story may be not reflecting our hypotheses. So I actually would like to assert that we have more hypotheses than we let on or tell other people about.
So I think the kind of answer to your frustration is really where you started, which is it's actually not enough to just have one hypothesis when you're doing science. You really need at least two, because if your hypothesis is wrong, it shouldn't just be a failure. It should be support for something else, right? And so the idea that you frame something as, I'm going to do an experiment that's going to decide between two hypotheses, as opposed to I'm going to write a paper where it looks like there was one foregone hypothesis and no alternative. I mean, that's the answer, right? Is that you have, so having one hypothesis is really easy. having two hypotheses that are both plausible is hard. But what's really exciting is when not only do you have two hypotheses, but where you could have two scientists identified with each one that could do adversarial science together, right? So it's not a hypothetical scientist who holds this hypothesis, where there actually is someone you can point to who would agree on the predictions, right? And I think that's sort of where you started. So I would say no, you shouldn't just have one hypothesis.
So a former colleague of mine, Kevin Dunbar, has done some really interesting work where he studied the discussions that unfolded at lab meetings in 8 molecular biology labs over a 2-year period, and then he did a linguistic analysis of all of the discussions. And one of the really interesting things that he found there was that there were a few different ways that people dealt with unexpected findings. So clearly they had a hypothesis, they got something unexpected, and then what did they do? And there were a variety of different things they could do. They could repeat the experiment the same way, just pig-headed, do it the same way again. I must have done something wrong, but don't have to figure out what it was. Just try it over again. Or they sometimes reevaluated their techniques and made some changes and tried it again. But the third way, which was really sort of how he found that science was advancing, was, hey, that unexpected finding led to a new hypothesis. And interestingly, there was a gender bias in those new hypotheses. All of the new hypotheses were generated by women postdocs.
So in the study of psychology, turn me on. I'm certainly not an anti-hypothesis person, but there is a. Do you agree with the idea of just wildly measuring things in psychology? There's social observatories. Sticking a camera there, recording all these nice people sitting here, quantifying away, correlating with everything. Is that likely to yield something in psychology that we can then bring to neuroscience? Or did you actually need a well-constructed hypothesis that followed from some set of observations or phenomena or a theory, God forbid? So that we bring implicit hypotheses to the task, I think, is true, and that it's even better to have more than one is also true. To have alternatives is kind of the name of the game. But the way our funding is going and the way people think about psychology is increasingly about naturalistic things, right? So naturalistic scenarios, like huge observations of things. Is that going to work for psychology, or is that actually going against what we want to do?
I think a real advantage of that approach is that if our goal is to understand behavior, the challenge that we always face in the lab is one of what are we measuring? Are we measuring something that has real ecological validity? And then, as we make discoveries, we have to really establish that the thing that's happening in the lab has construct validity for something that's happening in the real world. So I think, something that's very valuable about studying naturalistic behavior, and I think you can study naturalistic behavior in a way that doesn't necessarily toss out sort of hypothesis-driven science as well. You can have hypotheses about the way cognitive processes or information processing or neural processes may sort of function in those ecological settings. But I think there's real value. I think we don't do it as often. We don't do it often because it's hard to get measurements, because it's hard to control. And I think the sort of increased movement in that direction is not intrinsically problematic. I think it really has the potential to enable us to understand behavior that is more like what we, the way these sort of cognitive processes and behaviors unfold in our everyday life.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit dramatic to think that it has to start somewhere and end somewhere, because that's just about arguing, and then we might as well be philosophers. But so it's instead of a straight line, and it's like you could start with like observations or hypotheses, but it's really a circle, right? It's really that we come into it with some hypotheses based on observations and data, and then we create new hypotheses, and they change ever so slightly or dramatically depending on what the nature of the new data are. And so this is the cycle, and I think that it's healthy to be in the cycle. And then there are some times where you want to go off and you become really interested in digging down in a result where maybe you have the same hypothesis for 10 years. That can happen too. But I think that there's a lot to be said, especially for early career researchers, and I think there's a lot to be said for realizing that there's so many, whether you call it levels or layers or questions that haven't even begun to be answered, and that being inspired by what is interesting to you can often come from introspection and observation. And I don't know how alive that is in the community, whether it's poo-pooed or like whether we have to be like, big data or computational models. Like you can just still think about a question. Just think about how memory works for you. What's interesting? Think about whatever it is, and you might discover not only your interest in what have you observed, whether it's in a crowd or in your own mind, but you might very well find that the way that you approach it hasn't actually been approached before. There's so many holes that need to be filled, and I know that when I started doing, I was in a neurobiology department and I started doing my work, I felt like I was in the lab with all of these people who knew more than I did, because I was the junior graduate student with like 10,000 postdocs. That's what it felt like. And I felt like I know nothing in this group. What do I know? I just have to learn. And then all it took was going to the coffee shop to look around. And then I thought, oh, wait, I know something here. And what do I know? And for me, that was my process. That doesn't have to be yours. But realizing that there's so many questions that no one has thought of before and hasn't been addressed, I think should be invigorating for future study.
Can I ask, Jenny had also said, is that what you mean with get lucky or be lucky or find your luck or prepare yourself for luck or something like that? Is allow yourself to introspect and read, or what?
I didn't really, I threw it out there to see, I hope people will find a way that works for them. But I think it's important to be doing experiments that go beyond the hypotheses that we can currently formulate.
So I assume that all of your students and postdocs, at least those of you that are allowed to just read and introspect and think and not be in the lab, therefore? They do that. Oh, they do that in the lab. Sure. So what are the recommendations? So again, let's get back to the hard parts here. That we're trying to find, bridging laws or linking hypotheses or something to help us understand the relationships between brain and psychology. Is the way to go introspection? You got to give me something. How do I?
That's simple, David.
It's that simple.
Well, it does. I don't think there's a formula. I think introspection may be the beginning, and then extrospection, like reading and understanding what's there, is really important too. And I think that we talked about this. I think that the scholarship and knowing what has been done already cannot be overvalued. And it's really difficult because there's so much work that comes out in all of our micro fields that you can barely keep up with what's happening in the last 5 years. I remember when I started a lab, I made a deal with my graduate students that I would tell them everything I knew up until 1994, because I knew all of the literature, and that they had to cover 1994 until now. I'm dating myself. But, that was not successful. So.
I forgot what I was going to say.
I think you raise an interesting point, which is that I think it's particularly challenging when training in cognitive neuroscience in this day and age, because there's sort of an increasingly large skill set that you're expected to acquire. So almost everyone sort of learns to program and learns new sort of methodological and analytical techniques, and these take a long time to master. And these are really important skill sets to to master at that stage of one's career. But at the same time, time is finite, and everyone needs to get 8 hours of sleep. So, so you know, it is a zero-sum enterprise, and you know, time. One only, if one wants to sort of ask questions in an area that hasn't been probed already, well, how would you know if it has if you haven't read very broadly or deeply? You know, many of my scientific insights have come from wandering through literatures outside of my discipline. I really like reading behavioral ecology, which is sort of like my fun reading area when I'm sort of not focusing on the primary work. But you know, when does one have time to do this, and is this really a part of scholarly training now? I think it's a really important part to be able to spend time kind of wandering, having an idea, wondering, you know, who's thought this before, has anyone shown this before, you know, and really diving down the rabbit hole of previous findings and seeing that citation and going and looking that up. And it's, you know, this takes time, and one as a graduate student or a postdoc or you know, throughout a career should spend many, many, many hours doing this. But is this something that, you know, that students have the freedom to do now? I think it's an important question.
So one thing that we talked about at lunch that I just wanted to include in the discussion now is that you know, reading the literature for me isn't a matter of starting at the beginning of a paper and reading it straight through. I am typically reading the literature to find out some specific thing, and to find out whether it's, and often to find out whether or not anybody has ever done it. So looking, you sort of transition from like memorizing a whole bunch of stuff to trying to find the holes. And it's a different way of reading a paper, and you might not read every word. You might just look at a couple of figures and be like, okay, yeah, this paper does not have the information I was looking for. Move on to the next one.
I try to not read anything and remain unshackled from the literature. That allows me to. I want to pick up something that Sharon said that I agree with, but I think it has all kinds of dangerous consequences, which is that the relationship between psychology and the brain is obviously not simple. But you said, tongue-in-cheeky, but I think you're right, that neuroscience is easy and psychology is hard. And so we end up picking the problems as we use neuroscience techniques of various sorts to try to address questions that may or may not actually be interesting parts of psychology. So are we artificially, let's say, canalizing ourselves in terms of the kind of psychology we can do because we do neuroscience-y stuff just because we can? I mean, the interesting parts of psychology may not be visible to us because we just say, well, we're going to do the neuroscience parts. That's much easier. I mean, are we missing something in psychology altogether? And is there a psychology going to be left in a few years, actually? I mean, there might be no more psychology anyway.
I told you not to let this get depressing. This is the start of the meeting. Don't bring us all down. No, I mean, I think this is the point of the cartoon, of looking where I couldn't see the cartoon. But the version I know is you're looking for the keys, not where you lost them, but where the lamppost is. I don't know if that was the cartoon. So, I mean, yeah, obviously, I mean, you know, thinking about the slide with the levels of analysis of behavior, I mean, because not all, but most neuroscience methods are limited to individuals, but huge facets of interesting behavior is not at the individual level, it's the dyad or the group or the societal level, right? So there's an example right there of something that you're missing when your unit of analysis is just the individual. That's not a criticism just of neuroscience. I mean, that's a criticism of a lot of psychological methods too. But yeah, I think that's, you know, this comes from, again, we're focused on learning all these tools, learning all these methods, and then we get anchored to them and we ask the questions that those methods are good for, and we don't have time to stop back and say, what are the questions that I think are interesting, and should I go do something else, right? So I'm agreeing with you, even though I told you not to let this get depressing. But I think that's, again, where this a discussion like this, I mean, I don't know if you guys are having fun or you're just politely waiting for the reception to start at 6:30. But, you know, I mean, I think that's what was fun about this, is because we don't have time to stop, because we're all constantly doing things too, and to stop and think about these things that say, okay, let me go back to why I got into this in the first place. What do I really want to understand? And then ask the question, what's the relationship of neuroscience and psychology around that question? And maybe the answer is no for some of these questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think I didn't want to sound chauvinistic either by arguing that understanding only comes from across-level analyses, because maybe your goal isn't understanding. Maybe your goal is predicting or knowing what works. So, for example, you don't need to know anything about what CBT is doing to know that it's helpful to patients when they come out of a session. There's so many examples of that. And if you want to understand behavior in the mind, or you want to understand more about what correlations exist or how to move around, there's so many laws that are out there in memory, for example. We know that there are ways to enhance memory, and those are phenomena. We don't understand them in terms of levels of analysis, like the trichromatic, the one example Kate was able to come up with, which I was impressed with. So for example, the spacing effect, levels of processing, the contiguity effect now has maybe that's one champion that we can talk about. But you can learn a lot about cognition by understanding the internal workings, how to nudge it around, how it works. Like the spacing effect works all the time, right? Almost. But we don't understand why. And there are theories, and I would argue, we haven't really gotten further in our understanding. So maybe, and it's okay if your goal isn't to understand it at a lower level. But I think the idea, the trope, is that if you can understand a higher level at a lower level of instantiation, that you're going to constrain and have a better understanding of the higher level. That's the goal, and that's what we started with. But that could take a lifetime or two, right? And so the question is, how much time is too much to ask a question? I don't know if these are interesting thoughts, but if the arc is so long, are you really asking a useful question anymore? And then useful depends on for whom. And
I think you're making, you're sort of advancing an argument that I know David has advanced before, which is sort of that neuroscience needs both behavior and theories. That in order to sort of serve the function of explanation, that one can't simply use neural measures to predict outcomes. That being able to sort of test a hypothesis or arbitrate between two theories by testing two hypotheses, that this is sort of taking a well-understood construct and probing how it may or may not be implemented, is doing neuroscience in a way that fosters understanding. Yeah.
So to make reference to the sleep talk just before this session, I think that's a really good example of something that isn't really fundamentally explainable by anything we know from a strictly psychological domain. Why would we have to be unconscious for 8 hours a day? That can't be good, evolutionarily speaking. Bad things could happen to us during that period of time. So there must be some fundamental biological need, and we see this in the connection to all the ill consequences from a health perspective. And I've been really struck by new findings suggesting that during sleep the lymph fluid can flow through the brain, and so it's possible that there needs to be some sort of cleaning process that happens to catch us up homeostatically, to get rid of all the stuff that we had to use during the day to think, and maybe it wasn't possible for evolution to come up with an alternative to this. So I think that that I don't think this is established yet, but that's an example of where there's the possibility that at a neurobiological level, at a biological level, there will be an understanding of what the constraints that evolution is operating under that can't come from just looking at the behavior.
I think we're willing to take questions, but while you guys are formulating your questions, which are likely to be very easy and pleasant and polite, what would you want your students to study? So I tell you right now, on the basis of our discussion at lunch, our discussion now, if you're a student of mine, then here is now what I think you should do. Read only philosophy and engineering. Don't bother with neuroscience and don't bother with psychology. Learn the toolbox of engineering and learn how to think critically and read a lot of philosophy, and the other stuff will be like falling off a truck. That may be wildly optimistic, but that's what I think. What should they So we have a lot of people lined up for questions, so maybe we start on the left and then we'll alternate. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. My chauvinism is for cognitive functional models based on behavior. And I see a real asymmetry between the cognitive psychology and the neuroscience levels. Neuroscientists seem to heavily rely on guidance from cognitive psychology, particularly the work in fMRI as an example. Going the other way, I'd like to learn about the benefit of being able to adjudicate between competing cognitive models on the basis of neuroscience evidence. I think there's very little or no progress in that direction. And I'll just close with two examples that I've been interested in. There are functional models of two varieties with regard to how you read English aloud. Do you use two roots or one? Another research topic, again, of just personal interest, is whether or not speaking two languages enhances domain general cognitive functioning. Now, I think there's been a great deal of neuroscience work on both of these questions, but I don't think it's helped us at all in deciding which cognitive models are on the right track.
I was just going to say, didn't you hear the part where we were supposed to get easy questions?
Well, I don't know the area, but I think the one could argue that if the existing neural data better predicted the behavior, then that is a way that it could constrain which model of behavior is better. So that's what we try to do in the lab, is try to always use behavior as a factor to use the neural data and try to understand whether the neural data is predicting the behavior of different theories. So that's one, it's an ideal possibility. I don't know in the area of linguistics and language learning whether that applies. One thing that I thought of when you were saying that I forgot to say is that I do feel like, and this could be because of my lineage and where I came from and my history, that I, and hence my students and the people that I interact with here at the meeting, have been very inspired by animal models and neuroscience over the decades, and a lot of the work that we do builds in the knowledge of what single units are doing in that brain area that we think is relevant, and so that's a part of how we think. And one piece that I think is really missing, and I think you touched on in your first question, is the neuroscience community doesn't do the same, right? So they, I think, and this is broad strokes, there aren't a lot of neuroscience papers that are looking at single units in brain regions or oscillations that are inspired by findings in psychology, right? And so there's a bit of a bottleneck, and that we know a lot about how the translational, that's a thing. NIH loves what's translational. Like, can you do an animal experiment in a human? Why is that translational? Why not understanding human behavior at an implementation level in the animal? I think there's something missing, and it's just not working. Like, I think, and really to make progress, there has to be a union across the fields where we're exchanging ideas and learning from what the other field is learning, and that's not happening yet.
I agree that I always thought that human speech was a good model for birdsong. At the risk of surprising Sharon, I actually think I'm actually optimistic about that. There are, in fact, cases where neurobiological data adjudicate between cognitive science models, in particular in psycholinguistics. I mean, this is not the moment to advertise that kind of stuff, but I have colleagues and friends who actually do. So I think there is that opportunity to have carefully specified cognitive science models that are then where the neural data can be decisive. So I think I'm more optimistic on that.
We need to talk.
Yeah. On this side now.
I have a question with reference to a metaphor for the mind-brain relationship. And the metaphor is this. It's the weather, the relationship between the atmosphere and weather as compared to the brain, the mind, because the weather we experience around the globe is an emergent property of the atmosphere that we have here on Earth. If you go to different planets, you have different weather based on the physics, the energy heating of the sun, things like this. And I'm wondering if that metaphor is reasonable for the mind-brain relationship, and I was going to ask that to anybody on the panel that would want to comment on that metaphor.
You don't like the birds or the water?
Well, you know, the atmosphere, no one directs what the weather's going to be on the planet. No one, we've got billions of neurons, and they create behavior, and this massive atmosphere creates weather. And I was wondering if that metaphor applied to what we experience with the mind-brain relationship, where you have billions of neurons creating the mind as an emergent property.
Yes. I think it's as good as an example. It's a great example of an emergent property, and I think, and you know, it's one of a number of things that are in nature that also is the case with the mind-brain relationship. I think we don't know enough, and hence there clearly is an emergent characteristics of the mind. Yeah.
Well, going along with that, then, it seems to me that the cognitive neuroscience community is about where meteorology was 100 years ago. Well, seriously, in terms of coming up with understanding and formulas. So, just a thought. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to go with no, because it's even more difficult than that, actually. It's like 200 years ago. Yeah, over here.
Hi. I'm sort of familiar, or I'm in a bit of a position that I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, which is what I like to call the interdepartmental shuffle, where, you know, because I'm interested in both cognition and the brain, that I end up between psychology and biology departments and also other departments, but that's besides the point. And I find that a lot of the people in my shoes who are interested in this and in this interdisciplinary zone are at the scanner level, whereas those that tend to be in that more biological path tend to be the quote-unquote electrode level. And I'm curious, in terms of getting that electrode level look at things to be more, to be looking more at the cognitive aspect, if we should be focusing really on getting those pure biology people to start asking questions about cognition, or if people like us who are already doing the interdepartmental shuffle should be looking at that sort of methodology more, or if at this point we shouldn't even be bothering because looking at something at such a small level is harder to relate to cognition.
I'm with Sharon in saying I think it might be easier. The neuroscience might be easier. I would go with trying to get your colleagues to get excited about questions at a different level, because otherwise you're just adding yet another task to your day, and you're shuffling already between a bunch of departments.
Well, I guess not necessarily for myself, but should it be people like us just deciding to go into that other types of methodology as their focus, or rather getting the people already in that methodology to shift their mindset a bit?
I think this is a complicated enough enterprise that we sort of broadly, psychology and neuroscience, are sort of and cognitive neuroscience specifically, that we are embarking upon, that sort of work at every level of investigation is important for something. You know, even neuroscience that is not at all interested in explaining cognitive function or even behavior, an understanding of how, you know, of neuronal signaling is going to be important for building upon that level. You know, I think every level of investigation ultimately is going to contribute valuably to the enterprise of understanding how brain gives rise to mental phenomena. But of course, everyone has to find the level of investigation to work at, and I think the right level is where your questions are. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. What's your question? your real, your deep question. Yeah, and then you should take it upon yourself in your training to do all that you can do to put together the pieces that you will want to do in the future.
Awesome. Thank you.
I have one more comment to make on this about, I think it's so helpful to be welcoming to people that are coming from different backgrounds and wanting to ask, questions that are sort of touching on the domain that we work in. It's scary to go outside of your own, and you'll speak with an accent in the new domain. And if people judge you for simply speaking with an accent or using the wrong, using the terms, using jargon in not the right, socially approved way, then that's an impediment to people succeeding in these interdisciplinary endeavors.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Great. I just want to say thanks for the great session. I'm really glad to have you guys up here talking about this. I have a question that's not directly related to psychology and neuroscience, but I think it's important, and you guys already brought it up, about when we find things that are not consistent with our hypotheses, and people often fit a hypothesis to have a narrative for a paper, and ideally to get in a high-tier journal. And that is like a really valuable thing in someone's career as a young scientist, to get a postdoc and get a position. And I'm curious, the incentive structure is built so that you have to kind of tell a story that's simple and exciting to a wide range of people, which is why journals like Nature or Science are the only ones that, non-scientists might actually read. I mean, that's not exactly true, but you know what I'm saying. And so I'm wondering, what can we do as young scientists and postdocs and grad students to, recognize when we're wrong in a paper and still get it published? And then what can you guys do, as well as faculty who are deciding who gets a job based on their publications? And when you're reviewing articles, I think we need to be talking about this and doing it a lot better. And so what do you guys think we should do?
Well, I've actually been really excited by the recent surge of rebelliousness around publishing and putting out results in whatever format, your blog or bioarchive or whatever, because I think that there is a push that's happening that will end up for good in the future. The other thing I will say is I think I'm sort of over it. I'm over the high-profile journal. I don't think it tells me about an individual. It tells me that they not only had a finding, but that they were able to package it and get it into a high-profile journal, which is good. That's what it tells me. But it doesn't tell me if they're a good scientist. And when I'm on a panel, a chair of a committee to hire, which I've had several opportunities to be on, I spend time reading the research statement and getting a chance to think, does this person think in a way that's interesting and attractive and deep, and have all the elements that I think would make a good colleague and scientist? Of course, that's easy for me to say. You have to publish something, but I don't think you have to publish in those journals to get a job. And there may be an advantage. It might help you get your foot in the door, maybe, but it doesn't get you the job because you still have to show up and talk to people about your science. And that is not about where your papers get published. That's just about how you think, what the results mean to you. What are your theories? Are you scholarly? Have you read the literature? Do you ask good questions? Those are the things that I look for when I'm on a search committee.
I just want to echo the bioarchive and add to this that there's stuff that the community can be doing to sort of diminish the dominance of the glamour mags. In particular, in my lab, my students pick the papers that we are going to discuss in lab meeting, and they pick them from these journals. And that's not good. So I would urge students, postdocs who are choosing the literature that your lab reads to not just pick papers that are in Nature, Neurons, Cell, whatever, but try to find something. You might find, I think the articles that come out in Journal of Neuroscience, for example, end up being a lot more readable than what gets published in some of these really compact formats.
Just a very brief remark, if I may, on the finding things that don't work out or having a hard time with that kind of thing. I think a good maxim to follow was the wedding vows that Laurie Anderson had with, who was Laurie Anderson's husband again? Lou Reed. Lou Reed and Laurie Anderson had this was their pact, which I think applies to young scientists or all scientists. Be completely fearless. Don't be afraid of anyone or anything. Have a really good bullshit detector, and be tender, be nice to each other, be nice to people in the lab. And I think those things, then you can deal with even non-findings and hypothesis non-conform things, but just don't be afraid, because in the end, it is more of a bummer for yourself, I think.
So that's a great argument for maintaining the tenure system, so you don't have to be afraid. You can. So when I stood up in line to ask a question, I didn't know the person before me was going to talk about the dual root versus single route reading models and connecting it to the brain. My student has a poster tomorrow on that very thing, B62, connecting the models to the brain and testing them against each other. Anyway, those are great Helmholtz examples, Kate, for the connecting, having a sort of generative theory that makes predictions that you can then test. I would add to that, I guess, the Wernicke-Lichtheim model, even though we know it's sort of too simplistic, it did also take brain and behavior and make a novel prediction that turned out.
It turned out wrong, though, right?
Well, conduction aphasia was found to be a thing. But yeah, I mean, beyond that, sure, there's plenty of details you could argue about. But to David's reading list, I guess I would add William James' Principles of Psychology, because what's cool is Russ Poldrack gives a similar talk about connecting brain and behavior, and he says, well, if you look at the terms William James uses, and I saw a lot of them on your slide too, the mental terms, that they haven't changed in 100 years. But that doesn't mean we haven't learned anything, and you can read his stuff and see that, well, with memory, we know a lot more than we did back then, the hippocampus and stuff. Anyway, I'm rambling, and I'm going to stop now, but great discussion. Thank you.
Hi. So one of the major issues that's inherent to psychology is that there's no agreed upon definition for many constructs. This is especially apparent in higher order concepts such as intelligence, emotion, and personality. And my question is, how could neuroscience help psychology with this issue? Or if I want to be provocative, is try to find a neural substrate for undefined concept in exercise and futility?
Yes. I mean, I think what you're saying is it worth diving into the brain if you don't have a good construct of I think that would be crazy. That's what neuroscientists do all the time, but they're not looking for explanations of emotional experience in humans or personality. Should personality actually exist? That's so. I mean, I think that's the hard work that Sharon was talking about, right? That's exactly why it's so hard, is understanding or having a construct or a description or hypothesis or theory about mental states and how they give rise to experience is extremely difficult. But I would argue that for me at least, is a really important starter before using the neuroscience to try to, fine-tune or inform those theories a little bit better and test some of those hypotheses.
But is there any way to use neuroscience to help psychology with these issues that psychology has been tackling for centuries? Like defining personality, defining intelligence.
I think
No way. I mean, those are terms from, you need the psychology of beliefs, desires, I recommend some fodder for mental hygiene. So what is the likelihood that neuroscience comes up with an appropriate decomposition of those complicated concepts that then have any psychological force? It just seems vanishingly unlikely because they're categorially different, right? This is the quote that I showed at the beginning. They're different in kind. This is why we need linking hypotheses, and this is why we're stuck. They're different in kind. That's a problem. So no. That's my answer, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think at some level, constructs like emotion are terms that refer to a diversity of subjective experience. And so, going looking for neural substrates of emotion is probably a futile effort. I think instead you have to try and isolate some component of subjective experience that you're interested in studying, or some function of a subjective state, But those things I think are enterprises that cognitive neuroscience has begun to probe. But I think the idea that we will discover things that reflect some neural embedding of a concept like personality or emotion. Yeah, I agree. It won't exist in some like clear form of implementation because it's just not. Yeah, it doesn't function that way.
Well, I disagree with my colleagues up here. I do, I do think that neuroscience can contribute to some kinds of some of the domains that you mentioned. Perhaps intelligence might be a fruitful one, not at the individual human level, but in comparison of humans to near animal relatives. I could imagine, a few decades hence, there being some findings that would be useful for understanding what it is that makes humans have the flexible intelligence that we have in comparison to other species.
Well, that's another kind of chauvinism, isn't it? Except we haven't learned how to sleep, but animals have figured that out, apparently.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. My question was relating to the different levels of analysis, like behavior versus brain versus micro behavior versus oscillations, and the dimensionality of the phenomena at each of those levels. So basically, I am curious if say, observing something at the behavior level, we can decompose it into a low-dimensional kind of explainable theory. And does it become more difficult to do that when we get it to the neural level, where the data that we observe are very high-dimensional? And is it useful to kind of, I guess, by high-dimensional, if we're doing fMRI, we have like 100,000 voxels or so per brain slice, and we're trying to decompose that into maybe some type of relevant network. So then we try to decompose that into 17 networks, and then so on and so forth to try to decompose the data into this low-dimensional structure that we can explain easily. And I'm wondering if that's even, if there's a relationship between the dimensionality of the data, of the phenomena that we observe, depending on the level of analysis that we look at, and if explainability at the level of behavior looks the same as the explainability at the level of neural data, or if predictions and like the easiest way to explain neural data is still with like a very high-dimensional model to try to explain the brain.
So it seems like you're going back and forth between thinking about the dimensionality of the measurements we have and the dimensionality of the phenomena or the constructs. And there's where I would take issue with the premise of your question. I don't think the mental states are fundamentally lower dimensional, or that psychological measurements are tapping into lower dimensional constructs, but rather we tend to measure fewer things using psychological tools than we do with neural tools. And that makes it seem easier because then it looks like you have something lower dimensional. But I think this goes back to the very first question of where neuroscience data can be helpful, because oftentimes we have very blunt instruments with our behavioral measurements that are actually taking a highly multidimensional mental space and projecting it onto one or two dimensions. And the hope is that we can maybe get at more of that dimensionality by taking multiple measurements. But it seemed like in your question there was this belief that maybe the mental spaces were somehow had a lower dimensionality than the physical ones, and that I don't think is right. I think it's just a measurement issue.
Right. 3 quick, punchy, pithy questions.
Okay, yeah, thanks for the thing. Very cool stuff. We should talk about this more. The first thing, I'm a psychologist by training, and now I'm finding myself in defending neuroscience because I think we can really learn something from neuroscience. And the one thing I really think which is important is that we can learn about the constraints of the machinery. So the brain has constraints, like we have this 10 watts or something, which is the energy we have. Cognitive models usually do not account for these ideas. So I think we actually can learn a lot from neuroscience. And the second thing is, for evaluation of our models, I would say we have to go 1 or 2 steps further and say, let's say, do diagnostics and interventions with the theories we have. So develop the things 1 step further and look at if we can diagnose the stuff we're interested in and actually train it to be really sure about our models. So this is, I don't know what you guys think about that, but yeah.
Well, your first point is one that we made already. So I think any levels of analysis that you're bridging do provide constraints, and that's part of the argument for why why going to the lower level is interesting and provides an explanation, because it will constrain that. And that's not just between behavior and neuroscience. That's between networks and neurons. That's maybe between neurons and molecules. Like any higher level has these emergent properties that could be explained. So I think that we're on board with the constraints. And I didn't quite catch the model testing part, the second part.
Have to move to the next question.
Hi. I want to bring up something a little controversial, and it's already come up a couple of times about subjective experience. I think that's kind of the elephant in the room. It feels like what we are trying to bridge is something about human behavior, and obviously, the physical level of the brain, right? And I think, it came up, and the response generally was, no, we can't get down to the bottom of emotions or personality or intelligence. Well, intelligence was maybe suggested as something that we could look at. And I just wonder, is there room for introspection? Is there room for admitting that we are all people who are thinking all the time and know a lot about thinking because we are doing it always? And can we say, yeah, this will be hard to measure, but maybe that's the thing that we need to be measuring. Maybe that's the connection between these two more objective fields. So I guess, is less fear about talking about subjectivity maybe one of the keys?
I want to make sure that, so my earlier response to the question about is, can we pin down, can we operationalize emotion, a construct like emotion, in a sufficiently specific way to study it in the brain? And I think my point was that the words, the sort of lay concepts that we have for subjective experience are not, there's not a sort of one-to-one mapping between the word and the sort of complexity of the subjective experience. Subjective experience, of course, should be amenable to scientific study. I think we really all agree, and I think the idea that, William James on someone's recommended reading list, really, a lot of his insights into cognitive function were really derived from introspection about the way the mind works. I think that's certainly a valid source of hypotheses, and I also think subjective experience is absolutely a valid kind of topic of scientific study, just to be clear. But it's challenging, and I don't think the lay concepts that we have to talk about these things are the right kind of way of operationalizing them for experimentation.
I think you bring up a really good point, and I would say that in my experience, the world of neuroscience / neurobiology is not talking about this. And I've made a little habit of mentioning the theory of embodied or grounded cognition to my neurobiological colleagues, and very few of them have heard of it before. So there's conversation that needs to happen to bring that focus into the neuroscience level.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is, what's the difference between prediction and true understanding? And I keep wondering why predicting behaviorals based on neural data via some machine learning black box doesn't feel satisfying to me. And my own answer is that because as human beings, we like to make predictions by ourselves. we like to simulate the future by our own brain. And I wonder whether you agree with my notion of understanding. And we don't have the time to discuss about the next question, but if you do agree with me, the next question will be whether we are just not smart enough to reach that level of understanding.
I completely agree with you. Understanding happens in our minds, right? So the unsatisfying thing about prediction without that is that we have no idea how it works. The whole enterprise of trying to figure it out fails if we can predict it, but we have no idea how the system works. And then your second question.
We're not smart enough.
Yeah, we're not smart enough. Yeah, maybe as a field, right? But I think this is the enterprise we're embarking on. I think there's some belief that the optimism of the room is that there's some potential for discovery, for explanation that human progress will enable us to achieve. But yeah, it's a great way of finishing off.
Yeah, it's a very hard question. Thank you. And thank you, panelists, for discussing this afternoon.